So, Paul, as I said, now even about Paul, there is already before many Jews settled in communities in the Christian lands, rabbis dealt a little with Jesus and dealt a little with Paul, and parts of it were actually anti-Christian polemics. You will see later on that many rabbis and famous rabbis do not use these polemics. These polemics were actually mostly used by kind of the normal, the simple people. They have no halachic significance, so they have no significance in Jewish religious law. It is like, you know, like people are speaking about a topic in a pub or something, you know, or something in a very bad newspaper if there is a topic talked about, you know. So I wouldn't see these polemics too serious, especially again when it comes to the real rabbinic perspectives and opinions about Christianity or about Paul. But these polemics were around. But these polemics were also quite different from each other. For example, maybe one of the most famous or infamous anti-Christian polemics are the Toldot Yeshu. The Toldot Yeshu, nobody knows exactly when they started to be around, but probably from the 8th, maybe even earlier century onwards. And they have a source actually in the Talmud, but mostly actually from pagan sources. So from Greek anti-Christian pagan sources. So it's a different mix. Now, what is Toldot Yeshu? It means actually kind of like the heritage of Jesus. You know, where does he come from? And it's mostly a mockery of Jesus. And there are actually different versions around. For example, that Jesus is the illegitimate child of Mary, who was married at the time, and a Roman soldier. So it was basically like you know, that Jesus is portrayed actually negatively in that sense, and that Jesus is, for example, he went to Egypt and he learned some magic, and that's what he used, and with his magic he convinced some people that he's an important figure and so on. But this is something that the rabbis probably have from pagan anti-Christian polemics. It's not their invention. But for the rabbis, later on, obviously, or those who wrote on these Toldot Yeshu, there's the question, what about Paul? Because Paul was not described in this polemics originally. So they thought, okay, what can we write about Paul? And they read about Paul. And for them, they could not say that he's not Jewish. So they said, okay, Paul is actually Jewish. If we read what he said and what he did and all this concept, it's actually Jewish. So how do we explain it? What do we do with him? And you might be surprised that they say actually, well, Paul is actually a double agent. Paul was an emissary of Jewish sages to preach a false gospel. So that the rabbis actually took one of them, and that is Paul, and sent them to this new group, to this new messianic group. And he told him to kind of break away from Judaism, you know, because it's they are starting to be annoying. So let's let them break away from Judaism. We are too far away. And he was the one who did it. And he was actually breaking Christianity away, you know. So he preached to the Christians the need to separate from Jews, because that's what was actually his mission, so to say. It is interesting. I think it's, of course, utter nonsense. But what is very important for me here in this sense is that even those authors of this polemics, we don't know who the authors actually were, but obviously Jewish authors, and they considered that Paul was a Jew. So already in this time and until recently, most of the scholars wouldn't say that, wouldn't agree, but actually he said. Now another polemic, but like a more sophisticated polemic, is Klimat HaGoyim from Prophet Duran from the 14th century. And this is in that sense a little more also sophisticated, because it really analyzes the New Testament and speaks about what is Jewish in the New Testament and what actually the Gospels say, what is the message of the Gospel, and partly also the message of Jesus and of Paul, and that actually the Christians don't do it. The Christians don't understand it, or they don't do it. So it's kind of a polemic in the sense to explain the Christians what is really the message within the Gospels, and please do it, you know. And part of it is actually to speak about Paul, and it portrays actually both Jesus and Paul as Jews, as from Jews, as religious, observant Jews. And I want to bring one example, because I cannot bring everything, but one example is, for example, the discussion, how can it be that Paul says those who come now into the new religion, they should not circumcise themselves. And then at another point, he says, and every man who has circumcision has to keep the law, the Torah. So, you know, isn't it like contradicting each other that here he says they should be circumcised, here not? And Prophet Duran explains it the following. He says, Paul said in the letter to the Galatians, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will do you no good at all. And this is, he said to them, because of their being Gentiles. And he said further there in verse 3, I testify that every man who receives circumcision is under obligation to keep the entire law. Here he admitted the absolute obligation of the Torah for Jews, but for the uncircumcised, only the laws of the Torah, in Hebrew, Mishpatei HaTorah, are obligatory. So it's interesting that he says actually there is no contradiction about Paul, but Paul does it as a rabbi would do it, like every Jew would say it, because he said for the Jews, of course, they are circumcised, they have to be circumcised, and they have to keep the Torah and all the mitzvot, all the laws of the Torah. That's for sure. But those who are non-Jews, the Gentiles, they actually do not have to become Jews. You know, they do not have to get circumcised. They don't have also other laws to do, but only the Mishpatei HaTorah. Now there are, it's actually translated as laws of the Torah, but there are different types, different names for the laws of the Torah: Chukim, Mishpatim, Halachot, and so. And Mishpatim, what he means here is actually the ethical and moral laws. So he says, what he basically says, the Jews have to keep the entire Torah with all the obligations, and so that's what Paul says. And he says for the non-Jews, they only have to keep the ethical, moral things. They do not have to get circumcised. They don't have to keep kosher. They don't have to do the other ritual things what we Jews usually do. Why? Because he bases this on a concept of the Noahide laws, of the Noahide covenant between God and the entire people, that actually Jews have received at Mount Sinai the Torah, so they have to keep that, but that's only for them. But for the other non-Jews, it's actually only the 7 Noahide laws. You know, the covenant which is made when there is this nice rainbow after the flood of Noah, and that is valid for whole humanity. But this is only ethical, moral, basic laws, and not the Jewish laws. People should not become Jews, you know. And so from this perspective, it's also very interesting that he says, yeah, in this sense, of course, Paul is very Jewish, and he argues Jewish, and all is totally in the Jewish logic. Now we go a little further, and there's yet another polemic. Leone de Modena, obviously from Modena and from Venice in the 17th century, in the Renaissance time, he's a very interesting figure because he spoke fluent also Latin and Greek, and he had a lot to do with Christian scholars and also with Christian priests. And he was also respected by Christian theologians, and not only by Jews, but also like a huge Jewish scholar. And he has another understanding of Paul. So while all the other polemics beforehand and the rabbis, and we'll see most of the rabbis actually say that, yeah, Paul is totally a normal Jew, kind of a Jew of his time, he says something different. Actually, I can say that Paul is not mentioned here, but it's connected with Paul. It is not astonishing that the nations called Gentiles accepted the Christian faith as time went on, for the fundamental idea on which all the rest depend, that the Holy Spirit entered a virgin womb and engendered a God, held nothing new or difficult for them. They already believed that Apollo, Mars, and the other gods desired and needed mortal women, that they engendered the children of the gods and of man, and that they could suffer violent death. Differences in quantity and method in the links between the human and the divine were no obstacle to their belief, all the more so as the new religion was shot through with some of the truth of the Torah, which tempered the absurdities of their divinities. Over time, Christian propaganda towards the Gentiles intensified by continually inventing and altering elements of their belief. They gradually distanced themselves from both the Jewish faith and the intentions of Jesus, coming to resemble the pagans ever more closely. They finally managed to impose their religion under the Emperor Constantine. So this is like a history of Christianity, how it came about being. And it's actually the figure he says is behind this is Paul. And what did he do? He reached out to the Gentiles. And in order to do it, he took like the ideas of what the Gentiles already knew. And that is kind of like a mixture, you know, of gods and human, the gods and the human, and that they also maybe their children could suffer violent death. And so this is all that how Jesus is portrayed. And actually, this is something they are familiar with, and you mix it kind of with the teachings of Jesus and with the ideas of the Torah, and then you have this new religion, and it's kind of, you know, a mixture kind of old pagan ideas and Jewish ideas, but it distances themselves from the original Jewish faith. So in that sense, Jesus was Jewish, and his message is totally Jewish, but Paul and others actually changed it. And then the most important step, of course, is then when it becomes the state religion under Emperor Constantine. You know, then kind of, you know, the rest is kind of altered away from Judaism to this new mixture religion. And this is interesting because this is something that actually in the 19th century, Reform rabbis adopted and kind of developed further. So one might think that maybe Reform rabbis are a little more positive about the Christian religion and about Jesus and Paul, but they are not. They are, yes, with Jesus. They consider Jesus to be Jewish, and actually kind of that, you know, to simplify it, Jesus has actually nothing to do with Christianity. Jesus is one of us, and we bring Jesus home. But Paul is actually the one who kind of changes the teachings of Jesus and makes the break between Judaism and Christianity. This is from Abraham Geiger, maybe the most famous Reform rabbi of his time from Germany, who kind of started liberal Judaism, the movement in Germany and actually worldwide. And he was writing, he had taken up concepts which, the further they were developed, came into the sharpest contradictions with the foundations of Judaism. It was impossible to stop here, either step out of Judaism or perish. Of course, it was striving to spread outside. If the Logos had already appeared, a new world had come into being. Now this new world should form itself only through the belief in the appeared, risen, and newly forming Messiah. Only through him, albeit on the basis of the Judaism, the new world will be built. A resolute and strong man uttered this word first. He had the courage to break down the bridge, and that was Paul. Not a disciple of the founder of Christianity, who had never come into personal contact with him who had always proclaimed and emphasized with all determination the continued existence of Judaism in all its parts. Paul was first a follower of the new direction. He was a man of action who could not tolerate half-heartedness, either to stand firmly against the new direction or to develop it to its extreme consequences. That was the task of his life. So it's very interesting. Geiger says Paul was the one who was breaking away the Jewish Jesus movement from Judaism and made Christianity out of it, created, he's the father, he's the real father of Christianity. And he does it actually in contradiction with Jesus. He says even the sharpest contradictions. And he said, and that's very important for him to emphasize, Paul has never met Jesus. He was not a disciple of Jesus. Jesus was absolutely Jewish. His teachings were Jewish. He always said, as he said, he continued the existence of Judaism in all its parts. But Paul was not. Paul was a radical. First, he was a follower of the new direction, but he was a person of action and not of half-heartedness. So he had kind of the choice, either to reject it, this new direction, this kind of reform Judaism of Jesus, or to bring it into extremes, And first he was against the Jesus movement, we know as Saul, and then he became Paul and became his fiercest fighter, but in a new direction, So he also writes in that sense, at least indirectly, about the change from Saul to Paul, and we will see other rabbis will speak and write about it as well. Leo Beck, Rabbi Leo Beck, is maybe also a known rabbi, maybe the most famous Reform rabbi then in the 20th century, actually. He was also writing about the development of Christianity, and so he writes the following. What is called the victory of Christianity was, in fact, this victory of Romanticism. The man whose name is linked to that victory, Paul, was, like all romantics, not so much a creator of ideas than a linker of ideas. There is no other word than the specific word of myth, romantic myth, that describes this form of belief. Paul thus left Judaism. So for Leo Beck, it was clear Paul was not Jewish anymore. He left Judaism. I mean, at least from the ideology. And he was a romantic. He created a mystical, romantic religion. He means in that sense that Judaism was actually kind of a faith and a religion of logic and of kind of an enlightened religion, but Christianity is actually a second-class religion because it's mystical, it's romantic. It has no facts. It has all this only to believe in the Messiah and through His grace, and that He was really God and that He was risen and so on. So it's all mystical, and so it has nothing to do with real logical understanding, so to say. But what happened through this new creation of kind of mixing Judaism and Christianity that Paul did, then something new was created, and that's the next text. The Jewish objection against Christianity only begins with the Christian opposition against Judaism, which appears in a new and crucial phase of Christianity in Pauline theology and mission, which is directed against Judaism as well as against early Christianity. Here in Pauline theology, under the dominant influence of the Oriental Hellenistic mystic faith, Mysterienglauben in German, the Jewish messianic faith, which the old Christian community had nurtured in its belief in Jesus' messiahship, had become something quite different, the Christian myth. So it is Pauline theology that actually breaks away and also kind of in that sense falsifies the Gospels and the message of Jesus, you know, makes something totally new out of it. And also it's not anymore the typical Jewish messianic belief, but it's a new messianic belief. It's the Christian myth. He calls it the myth, you know, not a real messianic understanding. And that is, Paul did it. And in that time also, Judaism was against this type of Christianity. Beforehand, there was, the rabbis had no problem with the Jesus movement because it was Jewish, sorry. But now actually they are against it because actually Christianity went against Judaism. Interestingly, in 1952, after the Shoah, Leo Baeck is writing something else. This is 30 years later. He writes the following. He, Paul, was not, as has often been said, a Hellenist himself, but rather his attitude towards the Hellenistic world was the same as that of certain Palestinian teachers. Palestinian teachers means, of course, in the land of Israel at that time. Paul was a Jew from Tarsus, not a Syrian, Persian, or Egyptian from Tarsus. His faith was Jewish messianism, as determined by the book of Daniel and by the books which had their origin there. Nor can one say that Paul departed from the genuine Jewish faith because he emphasized his apostleship to the Gentiles. So we see here now, after the Shoah, it is actually that Leo Baeck changed his opinion radically, 180 degrees. Beforehand, he said Paul was not Jewish. He broke down the bridges. He was the founder of Christianity and so. And here he says he was actually a Jew. You know, he remained Jewish. He was in the Jewish faith. Why that is, I think it is that actually Reform Judaism before the war and represented, for example, by Geiger, by Leo Baeck, but also by others, by Philipson and others, important liberal theologians, was actually quite polemic against Christianity. Because actually the Christian theologians were very polemic against Judaism. And so they answered the Christian anti-Jewish polemic with a Jewish anti-Christian polemic. But obviously after the war, he understood that this polemic and this conflict between Judaism and Christianity, that is actually of no help, but it was helping the anti-Semites to do the Shoah. And so he changed his mind. He became then, but only after the Shoah, a real important spokesperson for dialogue and for a very positive attitude to Christianity. So it's interesting, unfortunately, but that's another topic. We speak about Paul. Now, what about the Orthodox rabbis? There are famous Orthodox rabbis who were very skeptical with Paul, and maybe not so much with Paul himself as a person, but with what came out of Pauline theology. And one is, for example, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Britain, who passed away some years ago too early. He said, Paul was the architect of a Christian theology, which deemed that the covenant between God and his people was now broken. Pauline theology demonstrates to the full how remote from and catastrophic to Judaism is the doctrine of a second choice, a new election. No doctrine has cost more Jewish lives. You know, so he's very negative about it because he says this idea of breaking away also the bridges, of creating something new, that started actually this breakaway process in which actually a Christian anti-Jewish theology was established that actually became so problematic, which actually was responsible, obviously, during the Middle Ages of the pogroms and of all these anti-Jewish ideas, and until actually then at the end of the day also the racial anti-Semitism, which actually had the basis in Christian anti-Jewish theology. So we can see Rabbi Sacks is not very positive about Paul. Also, he doesn't write anything about himself, like about Paul himself, or he thinks if he was Jewish or not. Now, other Orthodox rabbis had a different approach and opinion. One of the most important is Rabbi Jacob Emden. So we can see he is a rabbi in the 18th century, in the time of Enlightenment, so still before the emancipation, but in time of Enlightenment, a very conservative Orthodox rabbi, actually, very from rabbi. Very skeptical about Jewish enlightenment, about Haskalah, for example. But he was nevertheless very open-minded towards Christianity. He wrote a lot about the Gospels and about Jesus. Now I will I will show you what he wrote about Paul, parts of it. He wrote, "For it is recognized that also the Nazarene and his disciples," Nazarene is Jesus, "and his disciples, especially Paul, warn concerning the Torah of the Israelites, to which all the circumcised are tied. And if they are truly Christians, they will observe their faith with truth. You may therefore understand that Paul doesn't contradict himself because of his circumcision of Timothy, for the latter was the son of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father." Acts 16. "And Paul was a scholar, an attendant of Rabban Gamliel the elder, well versed in the laws of the Torah. He knew that the child of a Jewish mother is considered a full Jew, even if the father should be a Gentile, as it is written in Talmud and the codes. He therefore acted entirely in accordance with the halakha by circumcising Timothy. This would be in line with his position that all should remain within their own faith." 1 Corinthians chapter 7. "Timothy, born of a Jewish mother, had the law of a Jew and had to be circumcised, just as he was enjoined to observe all commandments of the Torah. For all who are circumcised are bound by all the commandments." So he says that actually Jesus and Paul, both of them, were concerned about the Torah for the Jews. They said, you should keep the Jewish traditions and the Torah, and if you are truly Christians, you will keep your faith, so that is, Jews is for the Judaism is for the Jews and Christianity is for the Christians. It's all fine. We both have our faith. We stay true to our faith, and Christians stay true to the Christian faith. And Paul was Jewish, and he was not only Jewish. We have to be very carefully seeing what he wrote. He said he was a scholar, a student of Rabban Gamliel the elder, one of the greatest rabbis of the Jewish tradition, maybe the greatest. And Paul was a student of him, so it's really clear that he says he's Jewish, and not only Jewish, he's even a big Jewish scholar and rabbi. That was what Paul actually was. And then he explains again with the circumcision. Timothy, he had to be circumcised because his mother was Jewish, so he was Jewish, so he had to keep the Torah. But the others is different, and there it goes further. "Certainly, therefore, there is no doubt that one who seeks the truth will agree with our thesis that the Nazarene and his apostles never meant to abolish the Torah of Moses from one who was born a Jew. Likewise did Paul write in his letter to the Corinthians that each should adhere to the faith in which each was called, and therefore acted in accordance with the Torah by forbidding circumcision to Gentiles, according to the halakha, as it is forbidden to one who does not accept the yoke of the commandments. They knew that it would be too difficult for the Gentiles to observe the Torah of Moses. They therefore forbade them to circumcise, and it would suffice that they observe the 7 Noahide commandments as commanded upon them through the halakha from Moses at Sinai. So that is actually, if Paul forbade the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to be circumcised, it is not that he goes out of the Jewish tradition, but he keeps in the Jewish tradition. He knows that actually a non-Jew should not act like a Jew. He should not be circumcised if he does not want to accept the whole Torah and become Jewish. And obviously, they should not become Jewish. They should only keep the 7 Noahide laws. And therefore, he was saying, no, for the Gentiles, it's forbidden actually to circumcise. Yeah. And but then what happened? Because of these errant scholars, like scholars who were not knowing who was mistaken, and he means here some of the early church fathers, obviously, hatred has increased towards the Jews, who are blameless of any guilt and proceed innocently to observe the Torah with all their heart, imbued with the fear of God. They should instead bring their people to love the ancient children of Israel, who remain loyal to their God, as indeed commanded to Christians by the original teachers. So he reaches out to Christians and says, please do not misunderstand. It never says anywhere in the Gospels or by Paul or by Jesus that you should hate us. We should be together. You should actually have actually love and a good relationship with us. And actually, Jacob Emden, Rav Emden, he also says then, I think I don't have it anymore. No, because that would be too much. He actually also reaches out to the Christians and says, we are your brothers. We want to be in dialogue with you. You know, he calls Christians brothers. And he says, if you help us keeping the Torah, we will help you keep your faith. So it's kind of a win-win situation. You know, we help you and support you with your Christianity, and you help and support us with our Jewish faith. So it's really a partnership amongst religious people who believe actually in the same God. I think very modern for his time in the 18th century. Rabbi Taubes, Chaim Tzvi Taubes, he was the chief rabbi of Zurich between 1936 and 1966, so very difficult times and changing times. And he had a visionary lecture, and also he wrote an essay out of this topic in 1940. So kind of during the Second World War, when it was clear what happens and also what happens to the Jews, he wrote about the common in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He actually outlined a vision for a dialogue of these 3 Abrahamic monotheistic religions. I think it's amazing. Unfortunately, nobody read it there, and nobody reads it today. It's a little forgotten. Sorry. So he also writes about Paul. Revealed religion conveys the word of God, which only addresses people and peoples, where the primary functions of life have to be regulated. God only speaks to people or peoples when the ultimate existentiality of their existence is called into questions. He says, if God speaks to somebody, it's very dramatic. It's a dramatic situation. And that's actually what happened with Paul. And he says the change, what actually made Saul Paul, was due to the shattering experience of doom and gloom, and which he shared with the pagan people of his time. Paul was only endowed with heavenly authority with Gentiles peoples, but not for Israel. But God's plan of salvation was the Jews stick to their old and proven form of metaphysical life insurance. The Gentiles, on the other hand, are giving the same thing, only in a slightly different form, and thereby life is given again. That was also in Israel's plan. With the sword, one conquers and kills, and with the word, one comforts and gives life. Israel never wanted to conquer the Gentile peoples, but to comfort them and to bring them new streams of life. Christianity has thus brought the dead back to life and dying peoples to new life. So it's very interesting how he understands Paul's missions and the change from Saul to Paul. He said at that time of Paul, there was a dramatic situation in the world. What we call the Western world, the Western civilization, basically the Roman Empire, that was about to totally collapse. It was empty. it was at the end. It was about to die. And the pagans, they were looking for life. They were looking for something new that saved them spiritually. And that's when God actually sent Paul. When he made him Paul and give him the authority for the Gentile peoples to save them. And that's exactly, actually, I have to admit, when I read Paul, I can see how he is driven to save the people. He really believes it's the end of the days. And if people are not believing in God, they will actually die, you know. So he wants to give life. He wants to save the people. That's why he reaches out and to get as many people as possible. This is also what I read, actually, when I understand, what I feel when I read him. And this is what Rav Taube says here. He was really driven, mission-driven, but he says it was heavenly authority. God sent him to save the people, that they go away from their paganism, from this empty idol worship, and they suddenly understand that God is the one God, and that they take the Torah in a slightly different form, as he puts it. I don't know if it's so slightly different, but in a different form. But it's also important, Jews stick to their Judaism, you know, because they know already God. And then now the pagans accept the new religion, which has their connection to God. And so both have their connections to God in a different way, but it's basically the same thing in the essence. You know, that's very important. And it's also important that he says, Israel is not against the Gentiles. Of course, the Torah is against idol worship, but only because idol worship is so immoral and unethical. But it's not against the people. It's about the system. So you change the system and we embrace you. The idea of the mission of the Jews was to bring life to the people, to bring the word of God to the people. That's what we wanted to do. And actually, that's what Jesus and his followers and Paul at the end actually achieved. Okay, I skipped this because we are already, I spoke already more than I wanted to. At the end, Jacob Taubes. I don't know if Jacob Taubes says something to you. In the German-speaking world, he's very famous. He was a professor for Jewish studies. He was somebody who, his whole life, dealt with Paul. And it's actually not a coincidence, because he's the son of Rabbi Taubes, and he himself actually also became an Orthodox rabbi, what many people don't know. He was in Switzerland at the yeshiva in Montreux, but later he never left Judaism, but he was not observant anymore. He was not religious, but he continued with Jewish religion and also with Paul and Paulist theology, and wrote a famous book about Paul, and became a Paul scholar, which certainly that was influenced by his father. He studied actually also at the University of Zurich as a young man, apocalyptical ideas, and so that was also from his father inspired. But his father hoped, obviously, that he becomes a rabbi and continues the rabbinic career and not the academic career. Anyway, I spoke too much already about Jacob Taubes. There's only one sentence which I found so very funny about Jacob Taubes. Is actually in his intro of his book, The Political Theology of Paul. And he says, so far, so good. This is the point at which little Jacob Taubes, that's what he speaks about himself, comes along and enters into the business of gathering the heretic back into the fold. Because I regard him, and that's interesting, though, the heretic Paul, he brings him back into the fold, back to the Jewish people, because I regard him, and this is my own personal business, as more Jewish than any Reform rabbi or any liberal rabbi I ever heard in Germany, England, America, Switzerland, or anywhere. So it's, I think, very funny that he says, Paul definitely is more Jewish than many Jews. Okay, so until here, and then I give the word back to Maros or Milos. I don't know who continues. Micro.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. So this moment, I will stop the recording. And obviously,